Imagine being in one of the greatest rock bands of all time, touring the world, creating timeless music, and living the dream millions could only fantasize about. Now imagine that behind all the glamour, the sold-out stadiums, and the legendary performances, there was a tension so thick you could cut it with a knife. A clash of personalities so profound that it would simmer quietly for decades, hidden behind smiles for the cameras and professional courtesy on stage. This is the untold story of Bill Wyman and Keith Richards, two titans of rock and roll who shared a stage for over 3 decades but could never truly share a bond. After 30 years of silence, Bill Wyman has finally opened up about the real reasons he couldn't stand Keith Richards, and what is revealed will change everything you thought you knew about the Rolling Stones. The truth is more complex, more human, and more fascinating than any tabloid headline could ever capture. This is a story about ego, artistry, respect, and the price of immortality in rock and roll. The Rolling Stones weren't just a band. They were a cultural phenomenon, a force of nature that redefined music, fashion, and rebellion itself. From their formation in 1962, they became the bad boys of rock, the dangerous alternative to the Beatles' clean-cut image. At the heart of this legendary group were personalities as different as night and day. Mick Jagger, the preening frontman with moves that scandalized a generation. Keith Richards, the riff master with a cigarette perpetually dangling from his lips, looking like he'd just crawled out of a beautiful disaster. Charlie Watts, the gentleman drummer who seemed bemused by the chaos around him. Brian Jones, the troubled genius who founded the band but couldn't survive it. And then there was Bill Wyman, the quiet one, the bassist who stood stage left, holding down the low end with a precision and consistency that became the foundation upon which the Stones built their empire. Bill Wyman joined the Rolling Stones in December 1962, just as the band was beginning to take shape. Born William George Perks in Lewisham, South London, in 1936, Bill was older than most of his bandmates, already married with a child when he auditioned for the group. He wasn't flashy, he wasn't wild, and he certainly wasn't interested in the rock and roll excess that would come to define the Stones' image. What he brought was something more valuable than charisma or controversy. He brought professionalism, reliability, and a bass playing style that was understated yet essential. While Keith Richards and Brian Jones battled for creative control, while Mick Jagger perfected his stage persona, Bill Wyman simply did his job, and he did it brilliantly. His bass lines on classics like Jumpin' Jack Flash, Street Fighting Man, and Sympathy for the Devil are masterclasses in serving the song rather than seeking the spotlight. Keith Richards, on the other hand, was everything Bill Wyman wasn't. Born in Dartford, Kent, in 1943, Keith was younger, wilder, and consumed by music in a way that bordered on obsession. He and Mick Jagger had been childhood friends, reconnecting on a train platform where Keith noticed the blues records Mick was carrying. That chance encounter would change music history. Keith Richards didn't just play guitar. He lived it, breathed it, and nearly died for it multiple times. His relationship with substances became as legendary as his riffs. His image as the indestructible rock god who somehow survived everything the rock and roll lifestyle could throw at him made him an icon. But that same intensity, that same refusal to compromise or conform, made him incredibly difficult to work with for someone like Bill Wyman, who valued stability, respect, and professional boundaries. The tension between Bill and Keith didn't explode in one dramatic moment. It wasn't a backstage fistfight or a public feud that tabloids could feast on. Instead, it was a slow accumulation of small resentments, philosophical differences, and a fundamental clash in how they viewed the band, the music, and what it meant to be a Rolling Stone. Bill Wyman later described feeling like an employee rather than a true member of the band, and much of that feeling stemmed from the dynamic between Keith and Mick, the so-called Glimmer twins who controlled the band's creative direction, financial decisions, and public image. Bill wasn't just sidelined by Keith Richards alone. He was sidelined by the Keith and Mick partnership that dominated everything the Stones did. But Keith, with his larger-than-life personality and his status as the keeper of the Stones sound, became the focal point of Bill's frustration. One of the core issues Bill had with Keith was respect, or rather, the lack of it. In numerous interviews after leaving the band, Bill has spoken about feeling undervalued and taken for granted. While Keith and Mick wrote the songs and collected the publishing royalties, Bill and Charlie Watts were essentially sidemen, playing the parts but excluded from the creative and financial rewards that came with songwriting credits. This wasn't unusual in rock bands. Many groups had a similar structure where the primary songwriters reaped the bulk of the financial benefits. But the Stones were together for decades, and over that time, Bill's contributions, both musical and logistical, were substantial. He kept meticulous records of the band's activities, photographs, recordings, and memorabilia. His archives would later become invaluable for documentaries and books about the band. Yet despite all this, Bill felt Keith never truly respected him as an equal, never acknowledged his contributions beyond the basic function of playing bass. Keith Richards, for his part, likely saw things very differently. In Keith's world, the Stones were about the music, the riff, the raw energy that made rock and roll dangerous and exciting. He and Mick created that music. They wrote the songs that defined generations. From Keith's perspective, everyone else in the band, no matter how talented, was there to serve that vision. It wasn't personal. It was simply the reality of how the band functioned. Keith has often spoken about the Stones as a democracy when it came to playing, but a benevolent dictatorship when it came to creative direction. He needed players who could lock into the groove, who could understand the feel he and Mick were going for, and then execute it flawlessly. Bill Wyman did that job perfectly for 30 years, but in Keith's mind, that might have been exactly the problem. Bill was so good at being the bass player that Keith never had to think about him, never had to worry about that part of the sound, and consequently, never had to give him much thought at all. The lifestyle differences between Bill and Keith also created a vast gulf between them. Keith Richards embraced every excess rock and roll offered. His drug use was legendary, surviving on a diet that would have killed most people, sleeping erratically, living in a constant state of creative chaos. Stories of Keith falling asleep mid-sentence, nodding off with a cigarette in his hand, or showing up to recording sessions in conditions that would have disqualified anyone else from functioning are part of rock folklore. Keith operated on Keith time, in Keith's world, with Keith's rules. For someone like Bill Wyman, who valued punctuality, professionalism, and treating the music business like an actual business, Keith's behavior was infuriating. Bill has recounted instances where the band would be scheduled to record or rehearse, and Keith would show up hours late if he showed up at all. Studio time was expensive. Other musicians' time was valuable. But Keith's attitude seemed to be that genius couldn't be rushed, that inspiration couldn't be scheduled, and everyone else simply had to wait. This cavalier attitude toward other people's time and effort particularly grated on Bill because he came from a working-class background where you showed up, did your job, and didn't make excuses. Bill had been in a regular job before joining the Stones, working for a company and understanding what it meant to be reliable and responsible. Even as the Stones became one of the biggest bands in the world, Bill maintained that working-class ethic. He didn't see why success should mean you could disrespect the people you worked with. Keith, coming from a similar working-class background in Dartford, somehow arrived at the opposite conclusion. Success meant freedom from constraints, freedom to operate however the muse dictated, and if other people couldn't handle that, it was their problem, not his. The creative process itself became another source of tension. Keith and Mick would write songs, often without input from the rest of the band, and then bring them to rehearsals or recording sessions where Bill, Charlie, and whoever else was playing with them at the time would have to learn and execute the parts. This top-down approach meant that Bill rarely had the opportunity to contribute ideas during the songwriting phase. He could suggest bass line variations, he could add his feel to the groove, but the fundamental structure of the songs was decided before he ever heard them. For a musician as talented and experienced as Bill Wyman, this must have felt creatively stifling. He had musical ideas, he understood arrangement and production, but his role in the Stones didn't allow for that kind of input. Keith controlled the guitar sound, the riffs, the overall feel of the band's music with an iron grip. Mick controlled the lyrics, the melodies, and the public image. Where did that leave Bill? Playing the parts he was given, no matter how brilliantly, and never getting to fully express his own artistic vision within the band. Financial disparities also played a significant role in Bill's frustration with Keith and the overall Stones organization. While specific financial details of the band's internal arrangements have never been fully public, it's well known that songwriting royalties dwarf performance royalties in the music business. Keith and Mick, as the credited songwriters on the vast majority of Stone songs, earned substantially more than Bill and Charlie from record sales and radio play. Again, this wasn't unusual, but over decades, it created a massive wealth gap between the songwriters and the rhythm section. Bill has mentioned in interviews that he had to carefully manage his money, that he couldn't just spend recklessly because his income from the Stones, while substantial, wasn't infinite. Keith Richards, on the other hand, with his songwriting royalties continuing to pour in from classic songs played on radio stations worldwide every single day, had a different financial reality. This economic inequality within the band meant that Bill and Keith were living in different worlds, even as they stood on the same stages. The touring life also highlighted the differences between Bill and Keith. The Rolling Stones became famous for their marathon tours, playing hundreds of shows, traveling constantly, living out of hotels and tour buses for months at a time. For Keith, this was paradise. The road was his natural habitat, the stage his home. Keith has often said he feels most alive when he's performing, when he's got his Telecaster strapped on and the audience is roaring. The chaos of touring, the uncertainty, the constant motion, all of it fed Keith's restless spirit. For Bill Wyman, touring was work. Grueling, exhausting work that took him away from his family, from his home, from the stability he craved. As Bill got older, the touring became harder to justify. He'd already proven himself as a musician. He'd already played the biggest stages in the world. What was he still chasing? For Keith, the answer was simple: the next show, the next riff, the next moment of transcendence on stage. For Bill, there was no good answer anymore. Respect, that word keeps coming back, because it's at the heart of what Bill Wyman has said about Keith Richards. It wasn't that Keith was cruel or deliberately malicious. It was that Keith seemed incapable of seeing Bill as anything more than the bass player, a functional part of the machine rather than a creative artist in his own right. Bill has recounted moments where his suggestions were dismissed without consideration, where his opinions about band matters were ignored, where decisions were made without consulting him even though they affected him directly. Keith's focus was always on the music, on the sound, on maintaining the Stones' edge and authenticity. In that laser focus, the human beings around him sometimes became blurry, their needs and feelings secondary to the greater mission of keeping the Stones rolling. For someone as grounded and human as Bill Wyman, this treatment was deeply hurtful, a constant reminder that despite 30 years of loyalty and brilliant playing, he was still just the bass player to Keith Richards. The breaking point came gradually. By the late 1980s, Bill Wyman was in his 50s, a veteran of rock and roll who'd survived the craziest decades the music industry had ever seen. He'd watched Brian Jones spiral into addiction and die in 1969. He'd seen Mick Taylor join the band as Brian's replacement and then leave in 1974, burnt out from the pressure and the lifestyle. He'd welcomed Ronnie Wood to the fold and watched the band adapt once again. Through all of it, Bill had been the constant, the reliable one, the professional who showed up and did his job no matter what chaos swirled around him. But by the end of the 80s, Bill was tired. Tired of touring, tired of feeling undervalued, tired of the whole Rolling Stones machine that ground forward relentlessly, consuming everything in its path. He began to seriously consider leaving, not in anger or with dramatic pronouncements, but simply because he'd had enough. Keith's reaction to the possibility of Bill leaving was telling. According to various accounts, Keith didn't plead with Bill to stay, didn't acknowledge that losing a founding member who'd been there for 30 years would be a significant loss. Instead, Keith's attitude seemed to be that the Stones would continue regardless, that bass players could be replaced, that the show must go on. This pragmatic, almost cold response confirmed everything Bill had felt for years. To Keith Richards, Bill Wyman was replaceable. The riff was eternal, the Stones were eternal, but individual members, they came and went. Brian was gone. Mick Taylor was gone. Life continued. The Stones rolled on. Bill could leave, and the machine would barely hiccup. For Bill, this realization was both liberating and devastating. Liberating because it freed him to walk away without guilt. Devastating because it confirmed that his 30 years of service had meant less than he'd hoped to the people he'd stood beside for decades. Bill Wyman officially left the Rolling Stones in 1993, though he'd stopped touring with them in 1992. His departure was handled quietly, professionally, very much in keeping with Bill's personality. There were no public feuds, no tell-all interviews immediately afterward, no attempts to damage the band he'd spent most of his adult life building. Bill simply moved on to other projects, other musical endeavors, and a quieter life than being a Rolling Stone allowed. The band replaced him with Darryl Jones, an accomplished bassist who has played with the Stones ever since, though interestingly, never as an official member. Darryl remains a hired musician, which perhaps validates Bill's feelings about being treated as an employee rather than a true partner in the enterprise. In the years following his departure, Bill gradually began to open up about his time with the Stones and his relationships with his former bandmates. He wrote books, gave interviews, and shared photographs and stories from his meticulously kept archives. And consistently, one theme emerged: his difficult relationship with Keith Richards. Bill has been careful never to descend into bitterness or vitriol. He acknowledges Keith's genius as a guitarist and songwriter. He recognizes Keith's importance to the Stones' sound and legacy. But he's also been honest about the fact that they were never friends, that there was never warmth or genuine connection between them, and that Keith's personality and behavior made Bill's time in the band far less enjoyable than it should have been. Keith Richards, for his part, has said relatively little about Bill's departure or their relationship. In Keith's autobiography, Life, published in 2010, he mentions Bill but without great detail or emotional depth. Keith's focus in the book is on his relationship with Mick, his love of music, his survival against impossible odds, and the mystique of being a Rolling Stone. Bill Wyman appears in the narrative as a competent bass player who was there and then wasn't, but Keith doesn't delve into their personal dynamic or acknowledge any tension. This absence of acknowledgement is, in itself, revealing. Even in his own life story, Keith doesn't seem to have spent much time thinking about Bill Wyman, which probably tells you everything you need to know about how Keith viewed their relationship. The musical legacy Bill left behind is undeniable. His bass playing on classic Stones albums like Beggar's Banquet, Let It Bleed, Sticky Fingers, and Exile on Main SD is foundational to the band's sound during their most creative period. His feel, his note choices, his ability to lock in with Charlie Watts and create one of rock's greatest rhythm sections, all of that remains whenever those records are played. Keith Richards' riffs are legendary, but they wouldn't have had the same impact without Bill Wyman's bass lines underneath them, providing the weight and movement that made the songs breathe. In a just world, Bill would be celebrated as one of rock's great bassists, mentioned in the same breath as Paul McCartney, John Entwistle, or Jack Bruce. But because Bill was quiet, because he didn't seek the spotlight, because he was overshadowed by the more flamboyant personalities around him, his contributions have sometimes been undervalued by casual fans, even if musicians themselves know exactly how good he was. What Bill Wyman has admitted, 3 decades after the tension began to ease, isn't that Keith Richards was a bad person or that their time together was entirely negative. What Bill has admitted is more nuanced and perhaps more painful. He's admitted that despite sharing stages, recording studios, hotel rooms, and life-changing experiences for 30 years, he and Keith Richards never truly connected as human beings. They were colleagues, bandmates, but never friends. The lifestyle Keith chose, the priorities Keith had, the way Keith interacted with the people around him, all of it created a barrier that Bill couldn't cross and eventually stopped trying to. Bill has admitted that he felt disrespected, undervalued, and taken for granted, not necessarily through malicious intent, but through Keith's fundamental inability to see beyond the music to the person playing it. This admission is powerful because it humanizes both men. Keith Richards isn't a villain in this story. He's an artist so consumed by his craft that human relationships became secondary. His genius with the guitar, his innovative open tunings, his ability to create riffs that define rock and roll, all of that came with a cost. The cost was that the people around him sometimes felt like tools to achieve his artistic vision rather than valued collaborators. Bill Wyman isn't a victim in this story either. He's a man who knew his worth, who eventually chose his own well-being over the glamour of being a Rolling Stone, and who has spent the years since his departure building a life that reflects his values rather than someone else's idea of what a rock star should be. The broader lesson here is about the price of greatness. The Rolling Stones became one of the most successful and enduring bands in history because of the talents and personalities of its members, but also because of the tensions and differences between them. The creative friction between Keith and Mick produced incredible music but also legendary feuds. The stability Bill and Charlie provided allowed the more chaotic elements to flourish without destroying the band entirely. You can't have the Rolling Stones without Keith Richards' uncompromising artistic vision, but that same uncompromising nature made him difficult to work with for 3 decades. Rock and roll has always romanticized the tortured genius, the artist who burns so bright that everyone around them gets scorched. Keith Richards fits that archetype perfectly. Bill Wyman represents the other side of the equation, the professional craftsman who enables genius but pays a personal price for that proximity. Looking back at the history of the Rolling Stones, you can see the Bill and Keith dynamic playing out in subtle ways. In photographs, Bill is often at the edge of the frame, present but peripheral. In interviews, he speaks when spoken to but rarely dominates the conversation the way Mick and Keith do. On stage, he held down the left side, anchoring the sound but never claiming the spotlight. This wasn't because Bill Wyman lacked talent or charisma. It was because the role he played in the Stones ecosystem didn't allow for more, and Keith Richards, whether consciously or unconsciously, enforced that hierarchy. The band was Keith and Mick's vision, and everyone else was there to help realize it. Bill understood this intellectually, but emotionally, after decades of service, it became untenable. The question of whether things could have been different is interesting to contemplate. Could Keith have been more aware of Bill's feelings? Could he have made more effort to value Bill as a person rather than just a bass player? Probably, but it would have required Keith to be someone fundamentally different than who he is. Keith Richards' single-minded focus on the music, his lifestyle, his persona, all of it was part of a package. You can't have Keith Richards the legendary guitarist without Keith Richards the difficult personality. They're inseparable. Similarly, could Bill have been more assertive, more demanding of respect and recognition? Perhaps, but that would have required Bill to compromise his own values and personality. Bill Wyman was never going to become a rock and roll wild man demanding attention. It wasn't in his nature. The conflict between them was, in many ways, inevitable given who they both were. What makes Bill's admission after 30 years so significant is that it breaks the code of silence that often surrounds legendary bands. There's a tendency to mythologize classic rock groups, to smooth over the conflicts and present a sanitized version of history where everyone was brothers in arms, united by their love of music. The reality is always messier, more human, and more interesting. The Rolling Stones weren't a family. They were a business partnership between talented but very different people who managed to create incredible art despite, or perhaps because of, their differences. Bill Wyman's honesty about his relationship with Keith Richards doesn't diminish the Stones' legacy. If anything, it enriches it by showing that greatness often comes with complexity and cost. For Keith Richards, Bill's departure and subsequent admissions probably don't register as deeply as they do for Bill. Keith has continued being Keith, making music, touring when he feels like it, living the life of a rock icon who somehow survived everything. He's been married to Patty Hansen since 1983, has maintained his friendship and creative partnership with Mick Jagger despite legendary tensions, and remains the living embodiment of rock and roll excess and survival. Whether he thinks about Bill Wyman, whether he has regrets about how Bill was treated, whether he wishes things had been different, we don't really know because Keith hasn't said much on the subject. That silence, that apparent indifference, is probably more hurtful to Bill than any harsh words could have been. For Bill Wyman, life after the Stones has been remarkably productive and, by his own account, much happier. He's led his own band, the Rhythm Kings, playing the kind of music he enjoys with musicians who treat him as an equal. He's pursued his passion for photography and archaeology. He's written books about his experiences and the history of the Stones. He's been able to spend time with his family without the grueling tour schedules. He's built a life on his own terms, free from the shadow of Keith Richards and the Rolling Stones machine. And gradually, as the years have passed and the emotions have cooled, he's been able to articulate what he couldn't say while still in the band, that working with Keith Richards was professionally rewarding but personally unfulfilling, that respect was lacking, and that leaving was the best decision he could have made for his own well-being. The story of Bill Wyman and Keith Richards is ultimately a very human story about ambition, ego, respect, and the complicated dynamics that exist when talented people come together to create something bigger than themselves. It's about the invisible hierarchies that form within groups, the way some voices get heard while others get marginalized, and the courage it takes to walk away from something legendary because it's no longer serving your needs. Bill Wyman didn't leave the Rolling Stones because he hated Keith Richards. He left because staying meant continuing to accept a situation that diminished him, and after 30 years, he'd had enough. Keith Richards didn't drive Bill away through cruelty. He drove Bill away through indifference, through an inability or unwillingness to see Bill as anything more than a functional part of the band's machinery. In the decade since Bill's departure, the Rolling Stones have continued to tour and record, proving Keith's belief that the band could survive the loss of a founding member. They've remained one of the biggest touring acts in the world, selling out stadiums and festivals, proving that their appeal endures across generations. But something was lost when Bill left, even if the casual fan couldn't quite name what it was. The rhythm section of Bill Wyman and Charlie Watts was special, a combination of feel and precision that gave the Stones their particular groove. When Charlie Watts passed away in 2021, that original rhythm section was truly gone forever, and with it, a direct connection to the band's earliest days. The Stones roll on, as Keith always knew they would, but they're a different band now, a legacy act performing their history rather than a living, evolving organism of the original members. Bill Wyman's admission about Keith Richards, 30 years in the making, is not an act of revenge or bitterness. It's an act of honesty, of finally being able to speak his truth without fear of damaging the band or his own reputation. It's the statement of a man who has processed his experiences, made peace with his decisions, and wants the record to reflect the reality of what it was like to be in the Rolling Stones if you weren't Keith Richards or Mick Jagger. His truth won't change Keith's legacy. Keith Richards will always be a guitar god, one of the greatest rock and roll musicians who ever lived. But Bill's truth does add necessary context, a reminder that behind every legendary band are real people with real feelings, and that genius doesn't excuse indifference to those feelings. As we look back at the history of rock and roll, these stories of tension and conflict are as important as the stories of triumph and creativity. They show us that great art often comes at a human cost, that the people who create the soundtrack to our lives are flawed and complicated, just like the rest of us. Bill Wyman and Keith Richards were never going to be best friends. Their personalities, their values, their approaches to life and music were too different. But for 30 years, they found a way to coexist within the Rolling Stones, and in that coexistence, they helped create some of the greatest rock music ever recorded. That's the paradox at the heart of this story. Two men who couldn't stand each other on a personal level but who, together with their bandmates, created something timeless. The final word on Bill Wyman and Keith Richards hasn't been written because both men are still alive, still active, and still capable of adding to the narrative. Perhaps one day, Keith will respond more fully to Bill's admissions, offering his perspective on their relationship and why things were the way they were. Perhaps Bill will write another book, go even deeper into the experiences and emotions of his time with the Stones. Or perhaps the story will remain as it is, a tale of two very different men who shared an extraordinary journey but never shared a real connection. Whatever happens, the music remains. The bass lines and the riffs, the grooves and the songs, they exist independent of the personal dynamics that created them. When you listen to Brown Sugar or Start Me Up, you hear Bill Wyman and Keith Richards locked together in musical perfection, even if they were miles apart in every other way. That's the magic and the tragedy of the Rolling Stones, a band that proved you don't have to like each other to create something the world will never forget.